Decadence. If you know what that word means, it should evoke images of giant Roman orgies with peacocks in the serving tables and people vomiting up their food so they can wolf down another round. Alternately, the triple chocolate cake at your local bakery, which is marketed as decadent. However, what actually is decadence? It's a very vibey word and people throw it around a lot, not really knowing what it actually means. However, I'd like to look deeply at decadence here. What is it? What forms it? What does it lead to? What it consists of? And most importantly, are we decadent and what we can do about it? This will be a painful journey through the times in history where history just stopped since people were too busy drinking plum wine while sleeping with their Circassian slave girls. Hi everybody, I'm Rudyard, the guy behind What If Altist, and decadence is in a lot of ways symbolized by men's luxury and status. And nothing symbolizes that than a landed title, an experience you can get with established titles. Established Titles is a company that sells you a lordship in Scotland. Yes, you can become an actual lord holding a title and land in Scotland that you can brag about to your friends. It also makes a great gift for friends and family. Your title's official and you can use it on stuff like dating app profiles, credit cards, and plane tickets. And it contains an actual piece of land in Scotland with a unique identification card. You can also buy these titles in pairs, getting a lord and lady neighboring plots for a couple. What's more, when you purchase your title, Established Titles also plants a tree in order so that you can preserve the pristine woodlands in Scotland and thus help the environment, which makes a pretty good gift. Right now, Established Titles is having a sale where if you click the link in the description, you can get an additional 10% off any purchase you make with the discount code WhatIfAltist. So click the link below or go to establishedtitles.com/WhatIfAltist and use the promo code WhatIfAltist to save an additional 10% today. It's the early 11th century. Two different millennia-old proud civilizations are under attack from barbarians to their north. India is being invaded by Mahmud of Ghazni, one of the greatest commanders of all time, a Turk from Central Asia who rose from obscure origins to command of an army of Turks and Afghans invading northern India. Mahmud's army slams into the Gangetic Plain, a region even then populated by tens of millions of people. He fights at the Battle of Cha very outnumbered and somehow wins against the local Indian forces. The Turkish armies are able to ride circles around the much larger Indian armies, having the Indian elephants trample their own troops. He then rapes northern India. And how do the local Hindu Rajas respond? Not by improving their militaries or taking on the tactics that made the Muslim conquerors so powerful. Instead, by building temples to please the gods to grant them victory. Over the next 300 years, the Muslims gradually conquer almost all of India, outnumbered 100 to 1 in population. Meanwhile, in China, the exact same thing is happening with the Sung dynasty, which is facing invasions from the Liao people of Manchuria. The barbarians here, again, outnumbered 100 to 1 in population, are able to defeat and drive the ethnic Chinese from their core region in northern China, forcing their relocation to Hangzhou on the Yangtze River. How did the Chinese respond to these military defeats? By composing poetry about how much they wanted to reconquer the north, while not actually funding or reforming the military to do so. There was a Chinese saying at the time, in the same way good metal isn't going to nails, good men don't go into the military. So there's no reason to reform or improve the military. Let's jump to another example. The Roman Empire is falling and the Germanic barbarians are outside a city in southern France. The defenders don't provide any defenses and are in fact working with the barbarians against their local rivals only to have their city sacked. It was incomprehensible that the barbarians could be a real threat after Rome had been strong for so long. It had been centuries since non-Roman threats had been in the area. In all of these cases, we see a shared subset of decadence, which is the sheer disconnect from fundamental reality that's manifested here through the utter inability to deal with the real world of literal barbarians coming and destroying everything these people loved. Decadence comes in many forms, whether an overt or insane luxury, belief in bizarre and backwards fads, and the list can go on, but on all the fundamental bases, it's an inability to come to terms with the reality that's staring straight at you, and instead preferring to hide behind some culturally constructed vision of the world. People have always just assumed decadence has existed since the dawn of time. It's one of those things like loneliness, powerful sex drive, or human nature of whose existence people deny on a philosophic basis when its truth is too painful to acknowledge. For example, Julius Caesar would just casually write out how the native tribes of France, the Gauls, had gone soft due to urbanization and contact with Roman luxuries, and so were losing out to the more savage Germans who had neither of those. Alternately, one of my favorite, and I think one of the most talented history writers of all time, Amaury de Riencourt, would write about how certain Asiatic peoples like the Chinese or Indians had gone soft against tribal groups like the Mongols or Afghans in the 1950s, and that was just viewed as the consensus historical opinion at the time. The only big group of people that have ever argued that decadence doesn't exist across history are Marxist materialists. These people believe that the only important factor in the development of human societies is economic factors, something that's extremely easy to disprove and pretty simplistic. And thus, for Marxists, to try to explain history with something like culture, chance, or real soft human terms, they will say that it's not scientific since it's not relating back to empirical economic conditions. Marxists have always been incentivized to push their theory of history and economics, which they say is inevitable since it's really the only way they can justify their economic plans that are otherwise horrifying and foolish. However, even if we couldn't disprove the communist understanding of history on an intellectual basis, it's been disproven in the real world that capitalism has only become more powerful, made the working classes vastly more prosperous, and communist states have killed tens of millions only to fail, thus in effect destroying every single one of Marx's predictions. Also, communists low-key support decadence in the capitalist order so that capitalism can be replaced by the revolution, so talking too loudly about modern decadence isn't a good idea for the communist movement as a whole. However, liberal arts departments at universities are controlled by, and I'm not exaggerating here, by the intellectual descendants of Marxists, and so we stand with a fundamentally materialistic understanding of human history that's just really at odds with the actual human condition. At the same time, the post-World War II reaction against Nazism meant that comparing any two cultures to show which is superior is seen as wrong has made the study of decadence kind of taboo as well. And I think it's pretty easy to see that changes in human culture have had profound effects on history. Think of how, for example, in our own times, how changing attitudes towards gay people have altered our society. Alternately, look at how we, say, wouldn't challenge someone to a duel like we would 300 years ago, and compare it to how crime stats have worked out since then. I think in almost all cases, our grandparents worked harder than we did. Once you magnify all these subjective cultural shifts over history, you can see how the real human character of society has immense effects in the course of history. There's this theory of a three-part structure to the development of societies that we've seen starting with the Greeks and Romans, and many historians, including myself, still agree with. This was a view of history that we've seen Livy, Machiavelli, Ibn Khaldun, or the greatest social theorists of the pre-modern world and the biggest geopolitical analysts today agree with. Societies start in a state of barbarism in which people are filled with vigor and a kind of unsophisticated power, just doing what they want without much clear thought, but making up with it in raw energy. This was Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, a Europe with witch trials, the conquistador conquest of the new worlds, and the wars of religion. These kinds of societies hate others for the sole reason of being different. Next, you see a phase called civilization, which is a society to temper its savagery with rational thought and articulation while also maintaining the vigor and energy that goes with the earlier stages. These societies are capable of thinking critically about themselves and making improvements, or taking in foreign ideas that work, while also maintaining a strong pride in their own culture. In modern Europe, this was in the 18th and 19th centuries, the eras of the scientific revolution, Enlightenment, and Industrial Revolution. Eras where intellectuals were able to bend the laws of rationality and science to benefit society, while the common soldier who still believed in God was willing to die for his nation and Europe's colonies grew. Finally comes decadence, which is honestly where Europe is today. Europe's young decadence came in the early 20th century when Europeans stopped believing in Christianity that had been the very bedrock of their society since the Roman Empire. This resulted in a series of horrifying godless tyrannies like communism, fascism, and the like that killed over 100 million people. Western society lost its virtue, if you want to say that. After the loud decadence came a quiet, optimistic decadence. Maybe Europeans couldn't achieve their great goals of being masters of the world and carving out a utopian future, and maybe Europe had been pseudo-colonized by its former colonies, but Europeans could at least build fair, prosperous, and just societies. However, over time, we saw Europeans even lose belief in their own rights to exist as societies, hating the most those who had the expansive or proud image of Europe. What had happened here? How could Europeans have seen the signs coming? When had this happened before? What does it all mean, and what should we expect? Well, let's turn to the historic precedent to try to build a logic of decadence. There's an underlying fundamental logic to how decadence and all its bizarre irrationality works. It is the willingness to put culturally constructed reality above reality itself. In this process, the cultural constructions become bitter at realizing their own weakness and thus try to tear themselves apart, while ignoring the outside world that they fundamentally understand they are at odds with. Let me explain. Humans operate through two different kinds of genetic selection. There's sexual and Darwinistic. Darwinistic selection is when the tribe next door has better spears and invades and conquers your people, thus killing you all and having their genes succeed. Sexual is that girls, or more accurately across most societies, the parents who arrange marriages, prefer mates from, say, a certain religious group or people who wear a certain fashion, thus resulting in their greater genetic proliferation. The adoption of, say, modern professional militaries was caused by the first trend, and the adoption of the hippie New Age values since the 1960s was driven by the latter, or the competing pushes of survival and popularity. In successful and healthy societies, the things that make people popular are the things that result in a society's survival. This is what societies are in the state of barbarism. People remain close to the earth and their surroundings, and so weren't too divorced from their natural biological nature, and so were able to keep their genes and group surviving. If we exclude how morally wrong the factors involved were, the conquistadors really did fuck, and spread Western culture, while the military conflicts of the 16th and 17th centuries really did set Europe up for world dominance. Even the witch trials were in effect a Darwinistic way of weeding out non-breedable women and installing more natal norms among women for a higher birth rate. Yet, over time, as societies develop, people become safer. Strangely, both intellectually and physically. Physically is obvious in that as the state becomes more powerful, people don't have to deal with external threats as much. What was true with all the cases of decadence mentioned at the beginning was that people didn't have to face external threats in those countries for periods of hundreds of years, meaning average people just stopped thinking about really brutal war as a real possibility. We see this trend in much of the modern West, where in large parts of the West, whether countries like Canada, Australia, much of America, and Western Europe, war is something that happens in other eras in history, and the best way to prevent future wars is to act as if they can't happen. Ask a member of the chattering classes in these countries how they would deal with external threats, and they would start with milquetoast statements like diplomacy. Well, if you actually suggested what diplomacy really entails with coups, arranging revolts and local wars, they'd shudder. Alongside diplomacy, you would hear recommendations of denunciations, cooperation among the global community, and other things that are basically meaningless. At the same time, it's inside the self-interest of the governments involved to pacify their own people. The legendary German historian Oswald Spengler talks about the process of moving from culture to civilization, or when societies shift from creating to codifying the things previous generations have created. A key part of this process is that an ideological managerial elite seizes power, which requires, I explain, the second point of intellectual safety. In the start of societies where people are close to the earth, they have to keep their values realistic. As an example, watching videos of Americans from 100 years ago, it's remarkable to see how much more disagreeable people they were compared to the present. People were far more willing to tell you exactly what they thought and why you didn't match up. That's because people were still clearing the frontier, and there was a clear set of strict values that if you didn't match up to, you were a loser. However, once a society's elite becomes urban, they start to construct values that are more about pleasing other people who crowd around them on all sides, rather than rural populations who have to deal with the real world on a daily basis. Unless there's a massive developmental or organizational difference between them, I can't think of a single war where a more urban country beat a rural one. Rome beat Carthage where the Soviet Union beat Germany. An especially enlightening example is Britain and France in the 18th and 19th centuries. Britain was a country where the elite lived in the countryside, and France was one where the elite lived around the court in Paris. French politics in this era basically existed to aggrandize the central court and maintain popularity, whether through fashion, waging expensive wars to expand the monarchy, while agriculture, industry, and the colonies floundered. Meanwhile, in Britain, where the elite were dispersed among the population, we saw agricultural, mercantile, and industrial revolutions while the colonies thrived. In every single decadent society, the elites are urban, removed from the means of production, and compete in popularity contests against each other that has little meaning to the rest of the world. We've scarcely seen this trend develop in the Western world, where the governmental ruling classes have become government bureaucrats who have no relation to the real economic and social conditions that they levy regulations upon. The economic elite are giant corporations that distantly control their various continent-spanning empires, and the cultural elite are all socially isolated from the real world in wealthy bubbles in places like Los Angeles and New York. As society centralizes, it removes people's ability to act on a local level. Once this occurs, it makes the leadership of the system dumber, since decisions are being made in the top by people unaware of the conditions at the bottom, rather than organically through the whole society. When people's actions are judged based on popularity inside their local social communities rather than actually spreading a society in the real world, stuff like agreeability, compliance, or being indoctrinated with the values of the society become important. High society becomes a giant court where people try to fake agreeability and kindness to gain allies rather than a warband where people speak and act plainly. This is definitely something I've seen in successful circles in America, where people act in overly polite and pretend to be sensitive so as not to offend. Society takes on a more feminine character as this sort of world generally plays in women's hands more effectively. What's happened in each of these decadent societies is that ideological structures develop to please other people rather than actually accomplish things. These ideological structures in fact try to push people away from the disagreeable real world, instead trusting their ideological documents above reality as people see it. This is a way to push away the anxiety of knowing the world they've created is fake. The historian Amaury de Riencourt also talks about how the society's knowledge gets categorized into a list of okay subjects to study and have opinions on, so society is not intellectually challenged. In Confucian China, this was with forcing the entire elite to study Confucian and ancient Chinese texts that had no relation to their lives. In India, it was domination by a priest class, and in Islam, it was Al-Ghazali, who came to the conclusion that study of the Quran is more important than seeing the outside world, since God determined the outside world at his whim. In Greece and Rome, it was a study of the Platonic forms and Epicureanism. In every case, the only way to judge real-world problems was to read ancient texts, with no space for coming up with new ideas. In the modern West case, it's the idea of a vague secular humanism based on Christian values. We're not in the era of the Enlightenment where people throw around wild ideas on how to improve the world. Instead, we have a codified understanding of how to deal with the world that proud departures from, whether colonizing Mars, waging aggressive wars, massive programs like economic expansion and the like, are viewed with suspicion. Universities, which are the entry to elite, are basically ideological indoctrination camps at this point. In every single case above, the decadent elite which ruled through control of ideas tries to then squash all possible competitors, who often gain their power through real-world successes like the military, business interests, or established religions. China, Rome, and the Islamic world all went through processes of self-imposed decommercialization, in which the elite regulated their economies into poverty, and we've seen the large declines of Europe as a percentage of the world economy, dropping from 28 to 24% of the world's economy, while the US has remained a stable quarter, as part of the exact same process. Europe has made the conscious decision to turn its back on capitalism, thus stopping its market and technological development. I mean, just look at how Europe's contributions to science with Nobel laureates as a proxy is a great example of this. The logic of decadence is the gradual removal of every element of society that would try to make trouble or make life more complicated for the urban-dwelling elite living inside their ideological cages. It is the subconscious removal of acknowledgement that there even is an outside world. As removal of any reminder of the outside world forms, there becomes no reason not to indulge oneself. If your position of power is permanent, there's no need to worry about working or trying to justify your position. This is where the word decadence association with overindulgence comes from. If you don't have to worry at the outside world, why not drink yourself silly, eat sherbet imported 100 miles by slaves, or throw orgies? At the same time, once the moral code of society is based around popularity, there is no recourse to actions being ridiculous. If people have lost belief in some abstract external idea of truth, there's literally no socially accepted way to discount people who have become completely materialistic and debauched. In turn, in societies driven off popularity contests, once being debauched becomes the norm, everyone must reach it, thus creating a competitive cycle of debauchery. An example of this is when late Republican Romans would compete on how exotic animals they could eat, eating ostrich, crocodile, and the like, spending ludicrous sums on importing these animals. In all these cases, we see court-like situations develop in which the elite looks down upon their own countrysides in the outside world, treating their social networks as the only world. In Asian societies, there is normally an emperor, with Ba Sing Se and The Last Airbender actually being a decent example of the sort of thing that happened in real history, with the emperor never leaving his palace, with thousands of girls in his harem, thousands of bureaucrats, flunkies, and his like inside the palace, building a veritable whole city isolated from the rest of society. In Rome, this also happened on a local level, with provincial capitals operating as mini-societies in much the same way. With average people so cut off from the mega decisions that would determine their lives, they start to become passive, fatalistic, and lose hope. Populations here stop being proud of their societies and have to be whipped into battle, basically. When people wonder why South Italians don't trust their government at all, or so much of the money the US put towards Iraq was spent corruptly, it's that these were the heartlands of decadent empires that screwed their populations over so much that no one trusts anyone else. This happened to differing degrees around the world depending on how parasitic the regimes involved were. What we see with decadence is a complete lack of interest in other societies. In India before the Muslim conquest, the Indians thought that they could learn from no other societies, and even that speaking to non-Hindus would permanently pollute a person. Muslim visitors described Indians as the most arrogant people they had ever met. When a British delegation arrived in China in the 18th century with rifles, steam engines, and clocks, technology literally centuries ahead of anything in China, the Chinese replied the British had nothing of value to them. The Romans and Greeks literally built their idea of civilization not off any objective measures of development, but rather whether other cultures spoke the same language as them. Something that may shock people is that I think the modern West is headed in the same direction. People like to say the West in earlier eras was racist, which is totally right, but the West was also very curious of other cultures. The West adopted so much science and technology from the Muslims and Byzantines during the Middle Ages. Meanwhile, you had massive Indian, Muslim, and Chinese fads in the Western world in the early modern period, with people taking fashions and ideas from those cultures. I mean, Schopenhauer and Hegel's philosophy was taken from India, and the idea of the social contract and modern secular bureaucratic state were taken from China. One of my biggest interests is anthropology and comparing different civilizations, and you basically have to read books written before the 1960s because people really stopped caring after then. It's shocking to see how popular travel and exotic documentaries and movies were before World War II. We now performatively care more about non-Western groups, but actual interest in the outside world's collapsed. You never see real analyses of how Western culture differs from China or India, say. You see no actual interest in how foreign cultures operate, or as agents of their own destiny, with the assumption always in modern social justice culture being that Western culture is so superior will always remain dominant, and thus other cultures should not be treated as their own agents. Alternately, adopting things from other cultures is cultural misappropriation, which is a weird, very backwards form of the same sort of customs we saw in earlier decadent societies. Decadent societies often do have a degree of self-loathing, and it might be subconscious sometimes, and it might be fully conscious. And the modern West's self-loathing is the furthest out example of this in history. And this comes from people realizing the decadent society and the cultural worldview it establishes isn't the real one. So people start to loathe that and try to tear away at the society's foundations so that they can get more in touch with reality. But the truth is that such attempts normally do more harm than good because they don't see what societies fundamentally need to survive and what aspects of that society are necessary. It becomes a deep emotional loathing rather than a realistic attempt to reform the society in a way that actually works. I hope I've helped show that many modern societies are dangerously wading through decadence. However, the future is changeable and I wouldn't fatalistically expect it to just happen. I mean, that would be a very decadent thing to do. However, how do we deal with decadence in the modern world? I would make the argument that Europe has waded further into decadence than America, since America still has many thriving structures for capitalism, science, the military, and the like. America has split down a path of greater decadence and standing against it. There are still many people who stand for the expansion of society in real terms, whether geographically in a space, economically, militarily, scientifically, or philosophically in America, which you really don't see in Europe. I'm not sure I would describe any other real societies in the world as decadent. The big Asian civilizations all went through phases of decadence that they were shook out of by European colonialism, which has since forced them to rethink the way they operated. However, for both Europeans and Americans, I would say we have to make a decision about whether we will accept decadence into our society. How should we deal with this? One of the main points to consider is that for intelligent people, decadence is never fun. They can see through the veil of their society running off fumes. Likewise, since there's so little progress and often really irrational social structures, life often isn't the best for normal people either. In a lot of cases, decadence means as much poverty in the lower levels as debauchery and excess on the higher ones, since society isn't working right. Lots of people aren't happy in decadent societies, but the culture just doesn't have a lot of new ideas on how to get things done in realistic ways, so the society as a whole stagnates. The main thing that benefits from decadence is stagnation. You know, all the people in society who just want to live their lives and not be bothered with the affairs of the world, they will support decadence so they don't have to think, and also whatever elite group in your society thrives from lack of action. I think there are two different kinds of decadence that come from the timescales involved. There's a slow, quiet decadence that comes to societies as they get older and stop being able to filter new information into their worldview. This is how the Chinese didn't use the gunpowder, which they invented, or refusing to even acknowledge the West's obvious technological superiority. Spengler called this the winter of civilization. The second kind of decadence is that of debauchery and lack of moral standard. This is Weimar Germany, an era of mass prostitution, drinking, and partying. This tends to ebb and flow over the centuries in societies, often as reactions to eras of extreme purity, horrible wars, or once you get eras of extremely rapid inflows of money. Unless it's a place like Brazil, this kind of debauchery doesn't last forever, since everyone eventually gets tired of partying after a decade or something. Combining both moral and intellectual collapse with partying is something like the fall of the Roman Republic, in which the moral decay of the Roman nation went with lots of partying and hype. Emperor Augustus was able to reform the Roman Empire afterwards, but Rome was still stuck in the decaying structure of classical civilization, which centuries later resulted in its fall. Our society is in the first group, and I think we have to worry about our society losing its ability to adapt. We aren't in the second category, and our society is sadly not overflowing with debauchery and 1920s style parties. The decadence here is largely moral and has not come through actual debauchery. This video was inspired by me going to Los Angeles, and I wasn't shocked by how much partying was going on in LA, but instead the bizarre things people spent their money on. Something to keep in mind is that this is the highest era of inequality in all of American history, but the wealthy today tend to not be super ostentatious in the same way they've been in other eras of history. Americans and wealthy Americans, I would say, on a higher average basis, are still shockingly hardworking. However, when you degrade the moral foundations of society, the rest of it will fall apart over time. We live in an age where reality is largely what we say it is, not what the real world believes. We are completely high on our abilities and not humble of our own weakness, and we see this with stuff like NFTs, gender relativism, modern art, streetwear, and the like, whose sole purposes are to show their absurdity and transgress boundaries without any other real purpose. I think the Western world needs to hold two concepts strong in order to forestall decadence. The first is a concept of personal honor. Honor is the idea that life has a certain degree of value and dignity given to it above merely the roles you were born into. That you can expect this dignity from how people act and defend it inside yourself and as an institution inside society. However, once you remove dignity and honor from societies, as we have in recent decades, we've lost so many moral pillars that we can use to forestall decadence. Look at celebrity culture. Apart from the nobility and royalty in previous eras, you would to accomplish something to be glorified by society. However, today we pick celebrities who are popular since they're relatable. We glorify celebrities who make fools of themselves publicly since we don't feel judged by them, and so we don't feel like we have to have a higher moral standard in our society. By maintaining the principle of honor in our society, we hold that we must uphold a higher moral standard that whatever our community happens to believe at that given time. When I'm scared and I try to imagine how many of my Irish ancestors died in the noose for rebelling against the English, or how horrible the trenches of World War I must have been, in those cases, my sacrifices appear small according to that perspective. In a society with a strong sense of honor, you can shame people who did dumb things and crass stuff like attend a sexual furry convention or buy NFTs since they are dishonoring their inherent value as human beings. When the Mongols invade, you fight since to not do so dishonor your own value as a human, whether or not your community believes that or whether or not you live or die. The second idea is faith. Not even faith in God, faith in goodness. The Western intellectual system since the beginning has been built off a combination of faith and rationality. Both of these, when taken too far, have their own problems, with overweening faith resulting in horrifying religious fanaticism and untethered logic spiraling into Nazism and slavery. Rationality cannot exist by itself. There's no one who says human life has an inherent rational value, and it doesn't rationally make sense to enslave the neighboring nations. These are things that we realize we would not like done to us, and so on moral faith we make the call. The assumption that the modern agnostic world makes are rooted in fundamentally Christian faith-based understandings of the world that fall apart under logical scrutiny. The problem rationality faces is that without humility of its own failings, it quickly becomes arrogant and tries to overreach, and then afterwards, without the emotional supports of faith, it loses hope and sees no reason to live. However, the truth is that you don't need a reason to be good. You don't need a reason to be alive. You don't need a reason to try to advance the human race, reach the stars, expand your nation. Life pushes on with its own logic. If you stand against goodness and the expansion of life, your logic is wrong. We need to take these as articles of faith and first principles in our society. If someone were to say, argue that we shouldn't colonize space and instead focus on problems on Earth, I would say that we should take on faith that we needed to expand the human race, and doing great projects was good in of itself that we shouldn't question. I could give a bunch of policies here, but that's a whole different video, and I think they logically follow from the principles of faith and honor. I think if the modern West can learn to fall in love with these two principles again, it will allow it to escape decadence. Decadence comes from when man turns away from the stars and instead drowns himself in wine. However, even if you're standing still in a rocket, you're still going thousands of miles per hour towards the heavens. What if Altist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, check out my Pillar, Pearl, and Patreon. As always, have a wonderful day, and take care.